One case.
Two interpretations.
And one question.
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Welcome to Two of a Crime.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about Mackenzie Shirilla, and I think this is one of the big ones, just like we kind of talked about last week with Casey Anthony. It's been a really big one with my generation. I feel like Mackenzie Shirilla is going to be a big one for like your guys' generation. So what happened was on July 31st, 2022, 3 teenagers got into a car in Strongville, Ohio. And there is some video footage that I think we released earlier this week in a little promo. You can see that the driver takes a very deliberate turn, turns on their blinker, very slow turn. And then, just minutes later, they crash into this industrial building. And we're going to go through some of the evidence today, but they said she was going upwards of 100 miles per hour. 2 of them passed away, and Mackenzie survived. What happens next really sparks one of the most debated questions in modern true crime history, and that is, was this a tragic accident or was it murder? So the kind of question with this case is, what if everybody agrees with what happens, but not why it happened, right? So most criminal cases are about figuring out what happened. But this case is different for that reason, because nobody really disputes that the crash happened. That's obvious. But what we're disagreeing about is a much harder question. Why did it happen? And that's where things kind of get messy. And that's kind of where it leads us. So I want to start with a timeline. So in the early hours of July 31st, Mackenzie Shirilla is driving, and the passengers are Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan. A short time later, the vehicle left the roadway and struck a building. Both of the passengers died, and Mackenzie survived. So over the following months, investigators examined surveillance footage, vehicle data, GPS information, and witness statements. And eventually, prosecutors would argue that the crash wasn't an accident at all. Instead, I think we end up with like this idea of like it was supposed to be like a murder-suicide. Before we get into theories, let's establish what everybody does agree on. So Mackenzie was driving, Dom and Davion are the passengers. Vehicle was traveling at a very high rate of speed. The crash killed both Dom and Davion. Mackenzie survived. So the facts aren't really in dispute. What they mean is what is disputed. So the prosecution's theory was very straightforward. This wasn't an accident. According to the state, Mackenzie intentionally drove the vehicle into the building. To support that claim, prosecutors focused on 3 major areas: relationship evidence, crash reconstruction evidence, driving behavior. Basically, they weren't trying to prove that the crash happened. They're trying to prove intent. So the state's theory is that there was intent. She intended to do this. So that leads to our biggest kind of interpretation gap. Can intent be proven from a crash? And that's kind of what we're looking at. So that's the question that sits at the center of this entire case. Can physical evidence tell us what someone intended? Because evidence can show us what the vehicle did. It can show us speed, direction, impact. But can it tell us what was happening inside of someone's head? That's the forensic interpretation gap. So one of the areas the prosecutors focused on was the relationship between Mackenzie and Dom. Evidence that was presented included reports of relationship conflict, concerns about possible breakup, and emotional tension leading up to the crash. The state's argument was that these issues provided a motive. So they weren't saying relationship problems caused the accident. They're saying the relationship problems explained why she would do this, if that makes sense. So a possible motive. So the interpretation presented to the court was fairly straightforward. So they're saying relationship problems created emotional turmoil, and this emotional turmoil created motive. But motive can be tricky, Lots of people experience relationship conflict. Very few commit murder, okay? So the interpretation here is the relationship issues were motive. But was this enough to prove that that was the motive and why this happened? All right, and here's our first major interpretation gap. The evidence itself really isn't being disputed. The relationship issues existed. The question is what those issues actually tell us. So do they prove intent, or do they simply provide context to everything that's happening? So basically, we're looking at evidence of murder, or are we looking at evidence of a struggling relationship? Does that make sense? So the next major category of evidence came from the crash reconstruction. And we've got a lot of evidence that I'm going to provide kind of separately because I just want to talk about like what we found as our interpretation gaps here. But investigators examined the vehicle's speed, path of travel, and point of impact. Unlike the relationship evidence, this physical evidence, it's something measurable, something that investigators could actually analyze. And this is where the case really starts getting technical. So according to the prosecution, the driving behavior itself was evidence of intent. So the vehicle accelerated to an extremely high speed. It traveled directly towards the building and ultimately struck the structure with tremendous force. The state argued that this wasn't random driving behavior, it was deliberate. So they basically argued that the driving itself was a message. So here what we're talking about is the interpretation is that nobody accidentally drives like this. And so that's one thing you can see from this image here, is that you can see the vehicle kind of veer off of the road, come back onto the roadway, and then ultimately hits a sign, and then it hits that building. Basically, we can insert like exactly what was argued, but according to the mechanics of what they were looking at here, the wheel essentially was yanked right, yanked back left, and then ultimately yanked right at 142 degrees. So we're not really going to argue this because it's not the point of what we do. But one thing that you'll see a lot in the comments from like the videos earlier this week is that people say that Dom and Davion were fighting for their lives. There's also like the gear shift being pushed back and forth like neutral. I can't remember exactly what it did, but there was a lot of arguments that they were basically fighting for their lives too and kind of knew what was coming. It's just scary. You know, you just don't really know. But kind of going back to what we're saying here is this may be one of the most debated questions in the entire case because nobody disputes the speed. The vehicle was moving incredibly fast, but what does the extreme speed like actually prove? Does it automatically equal intent? Or could it just be consistent with reckless behavior, emotional impulsivity, or loss of judgment? So the speed is fast. The meaning of the speed is the debate. So does extreme speed automatically prove intent? Investigators also focused on heavy braking evidence. So data suggested that there was no meaningful attempt to slow down the vehicle before impact. So there was no significant evasive maneuvers detected. Prosecutors said that this was important because most drivers instinctively react when faced with danger. And they argued that this reaction basically never happened. But I think we kind of are saying, was it deliberate or is there like an alternative explanation for this? So the prosecutor's interpretation was that the absence of braking showed deliberation. If someone wanted to avoid a collision, you would expect there to be braking, and they just didn't see that. You would expect steering, you'd expect some attempt to escape the impact or avoid it. But according to the state, none of these things occurred, which is why they believe the crash wasn't accidental. So the interpretation here is that no braking indicates deliberation. So again, I've got some other evidence that I really want to show, but I think I'm going to separate that out from this week's video. I want to just go through what we planned, but there was a lot of conversation that happened in our comments this week. So I want to kind of go through those as well, but just focusing on what we've got right now that we came up with, we're just focusing on these like interpretation gaps. So for us, this just means the prosecution was saying that no braking indicates that it was deliberate. She was doing this intentionally. But once again, interpretation is part of this picture. So no braking is evidence. Again, that's not disputed. The question is whether no braking can mean only one thing or whether there's an alternative explanation that could fit the same evidence. So like same evidence, different conclusion. And that's kind of our whole thing. Also, we wanted to include, to support this case, prosecution did present expert testimony. So crash reconstruction specialists analyzed the vehicle's data and impact evidence. Their conclusion helped explain what the vehicle did in the moments before the collision, but there is an important distinction here. Experts can explain mechanics, but they can't directly observe intent. So they can tell us how it happened, but not necessarily why. So our kind of question here is, how much can experts tell us about someone's state of mind? The next kind of question that I wanted to bring up is, why did so many people immediately believe it was intentional? This is one of the questions that really fascinated us, I think, whenever we were researching this case, because long before the verdict, many people already reached a conclusion. And the question's why? Was the speed? Was it the relationship evidence, the severity of the case, or was it the story those pieces created when they were put together? So I think sometimes people decide what happened before they even realize what they've decided, if that makes sense. Cases like this don't just exist in a vacuum either. So media coverage, social media discussions, public reactions all shape perception. I think that's a lot of what we've seen this week. As coverage increased, many people viewed the case through the lens of intent. Others questioned whether the evidence actually supported murder. So once this narrative kind of takes hold, it can be hard to separate the facts from assumptions. So again, our focus is kind of like, here are the headlines, here's social media, here's public reaction, but how do you separate yourself from this space of here's what public has decided? And we talked about this with Casey Anthony last week. Again, in Casey Anthony's case, we didn't walk away with a jury that was saying Casey wasn't guilty. We just had a jury that could not, our questions kind of like beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think in that case, there wasn't. Mackenzie had the option for a bench trial or a jury trial, and she went with the bench trial, meaning that the judge, she didn't have a jury. She just went in front of the judge. And I think sometimes it can be harder. There's a difference. You're looking at someone who's looking at the law and who is very, I think a lot of times, they can see the black and white. They can see the reasoning. They think about this stuff on a daily basis, where if you have like a jury of your peers, you can kind of get them with your like sensationalism. I don't know what better word to use other than here's this story that we came up with. Isn't it pretty, and doesn't it make sense? And people buy into it, and that's where you end up with either like the jury guilty, not guilty, or like you end up with a hung jury, right? Because you have to convince all of them. So being just in front of this judge, you have one person who's looking at all the facts and looks at facts on a daily basis. And I think that's kind of where she ended up in a pickle, because you're not going to convince the judge, of something different. The heart of this entire episode is the evidence being the speed, no braking, relationship conflict, crash reconstruction findings. Those facts remain the same no matter who looks at it. The interpretation changes, however. So you've got intentional murder, suicide attempt, reckless driving, emotional impulsivity. So different people can look at the exact same evidence and arrive at very different conclusions. And that's what we mean when we talk about the forensic interpretation gap. We kind of get to this point where we're like, what did the court decide? So the vehicle accelerated approximately 100 miles per hour. No meaningful braking before impact. No steering correction. Prior statements and relationship evidence. GPS and location evidence presented as planning. So what's interesting is none of these prove intent by themselves, but together the court believed that they painted a picture of intent beyond a reasonable doubt. In the interpretation gap, these facts are largely agreed upon. The meaning of those facts was not. So ultimately, the court accepted the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. Judge Nancy Russo found Mackenzie Shirilla guilty of murder. She was later sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. But even after the verdict, the debate continues. Not because people disagree about what happened, but because they disagree about what the evidence proves. And that's why we're still here talking about it today. Not because they disagree with what happened, but because they disagree with what the evidence proves.